Chicago, International Amphitheatre, March 1971. The building had hosted heavyweight title fights and championship wrestling cards for decades, the kind of venue where 18,000 people had learned to expect spectacle and occasionally got something that exceeded even their inflated expectations. Tonight, the program called it an exhibition. Nobody in the building would call it that by the time it was over. His name was Anatoly Volkov, born in 1934, in a coal town outside Donetsk, the son of a miner whose own father had worked the same mines. Anatoly had grown into something that the mining town's doctors genuinely didn't know how to categorize by the time he turned 15. A traveling strongman scout found him at 19, working a job that required two normal men to do, doing it alone, and within a year, Anatoly was touring the Soviet exhibition circuit, then Eastern Europe, then Western Europe, building a reputation that eventually crossed the Atlantic. He stood 6'5" and weighed somewhere around 700 pounds, the exact number always slightly disputed, because no scale at any venue he visited could give a completely confident reading. His manager handed out a laminated card listing 68 wins across 9 countries, 33 by knockout, 20 by what the card politely called opponent withdrawal, and the rest by referee stoppage. 0 losses. His method never needed complexity. He walked forward, absorbed whatever came at him, and eventually got his hands on whoever was standing across from him. Once that happened, the fight was finished, the way arguments with avalanches are finished. Bruce Lee wasn't supposed to be in Chicago that week. He had commitments in Los Angeles, meetings about a project he'd been quietly developing for months, the kind of work that demanded his full attention. But a call from an old training friend named Marcus Cho, who had seen the first night of Anatoly's 3-night exhibition run and called Bruce close to midnight with an urgency in his voice that Bruce had learned over the years not to ignore, changed his plans entirely. Bruce was on a flight the next morning. He arrived with his student Dan Inosanto and took a seat 8 rows back from the exhibition floor, dressed simply in a dark jacket, nothing about him suggesting he intended anything beyond watching. For the first 90 minutes of the evening, that's exactly what he did. He watched the undercard matches with the quiet, analytical interest he brought to everything, occasionally leaning toward Dan to point out a flaw in someone's footwork or an interesting variation in technique. Relaxed, curious, enjoying the evening the way someone who genuinely loves the craft enjoys watching it practiced at a reasonably high level, even when nothing being shown was close to extraordinary. Then the announcer called the final act of the night, and the entire building shifted. A side door opened, and Anatoly Volkov walked into the amphitheater. The sound that rolled through 18,000 people wasn't applause and wasn't booing. It was something more automatic than either, the specific noise that happens when a crowd's collective nervous system registers something that doesn't fit inside its normal sense of scale. Anatoly didn't really walk. He shifted his weight forward, 1 foot at a time, each step a negotiation between his mass and the floor beneath him, the floor clearly losing. The reinforced ramp, built specifically for his entrance, creaked audibly with every footfall, loud enough to hear from the first dozen rows. He wore a sleeveless shirt cut open across a chest that looked less like human anatomy and more like architecture, and trousers tailored to accommodate thighs that were each individually larger than most grown men's entire bodies. His neck had long since disappeared into his shoulders, one continuous mass of muscle that made his head appear to simply emerge from his torso, without any transition in between. He reached the center of the raised platform and stood there, and the crowd processed him the way eyes process something that doesn't follow the normal rules of proportion. The instinctive recognition that whatever standard scale they used for measuring human beings simply did not apply to what was currently standing in front of them. His manager, a wiry man in an ill-fitting suit, who moved with the brisk efficiency of someone used to handling logistics other people would find impossible, took the microphone and ran through the record. 68 wins, 9 countries. No defeats. He explained that Anatoly would accept challenges from anyone in the building, any background, any size, basic safety rules enforced by a referee. Then the manager said something that changed the temperature of the whole room. He said Anatoly had a message for anyone present who believed that speed and technique could overcome real mass and real power in an actual fight rather than in a magazine article written by someone selling lessons. He was tired, the manager said, of hearing claims that a small fast man could beat a large strong one. He wanted to settle the question with something more convincing than philosophy. Then Anatoly spoke himself, his voice a low rumble that didn't need amplification to fill the lower bowl. He said he understood. A well-known martial artist was present tonight. A man who had built his own fighting system and demonstrated it in films and on television, techniques that Anatoly described, through his translator, as entertainment rather than fighting. He raised one massive arm and extended a single finger like a crane beam swinging into position. The spotlight followed it and found Bruce Lee, 8 rows back. 18,000 heads turned at once. Bruce didn't move. He sat with his hands resting on his knees, already looking toward the platform before the light even reached him, as though he had known exactly when the finger would find him and had already decided what his face was going to do when it did. Dan grabbed Bruce's arm. Whatever he said, Bruce didn't acknowledge it, his eyes still locked on the platform. The translator continued. Anatoly said he respected that Bruce had spent his life studying how a smaller man defeats a larger one, even if he didn't respect the conclusion. He said he wanted to offer Bruce the chance to test that conclusion tonight, in front of everyone, against the most direct counter-argument available. Then he said the sentence that 18,000 people would repeat for years afterward. He said, "Tell him if he comes up here, I will break every bone in his body. He will not walk out of this building. He will be carried." The building went quiet, in the way very large spaces go quiet when something has just been said that makes everyone simultaneously hold their breath. Not the absence of noise exactly, but the sound of a crowd that has briefly stopped being a crowd and become a single organism waiting to see what happens. Bruce Lee stood up. There was no performance in it. He rose the way someone rises after finishing reading something and understanding exactly what it requires of them. Dan grabbed his forearm with both hands. Bruce looked at him and said 3 words. Dan later told people those words were simply, "Not now, Dan." Bruce moved into the aisle. The man at the end of the row stood automatically to make space, then seemed to register what he was making space for, and stood there with his mouth slightly open. The walk from the 8th row to the platform stairs was maybe 25 feet. In those 25 feet, the building found its voice again, rising in layers, individual voices first, then whole sections, the lower bowl producing a sound that mixed warning and encouragement and the specific human noise that happens when a crowd realizes something irreversible is starting and can't decide whether to stop it or simply watch it happen. A man near the stairs reached out and put his hand briefly on Bruce's shoulder as he passed, not trying to stop him. Something older than that, the instinct of a crowd touching someone walking towards something they're not sure he's coming back from. Bruce climbed the stairs and stepped onto the platform, which had groaned under Anatoly's weight and registered nothing at all under his own. He walked to the center and stopped, and for the first time, the 18,000 people in the building understood the full physical reality of what they were about to watch. Standing 30 feet from Anatoly, Bruce appeared to belong to an entirely different category of living thing. Anatoly's chest sat at Bruce's eye level. His shadow under the overhead lights fell completely across him. His single hand, just hanging at his side, was larger than Bruce's entire head. Several people sitting close to the platform described the same physical reaction years later in interviews, a cold dropping sensation in the stomach, the specific nausea that comes from watching something your body recognizes immediately as a mismatch that shouldn't be allowed to happen. The referee, a retired boxing official named Walt Drummond, who had worked rings for close to 2 decades and had seen things he'd rather not have seen, stood between the 2 men with an expression that communicated something referees are trained never to show, which was his own personal opinion about whether this should be allowed to continue. He looked at Bruce with the face of a man who badly wanted to say something he had no actual authority to say. Bruce met the look and gave a single small shake of his head, not defiant, just final. Drummond conferred quickly with the event's coordinator. The coordinator looked at Bruce, whose expression didn't change at all. The coordinator looked at Anatoly's manager, who gave the smile of a man who had stood in this exact spot many times before and already knew exactly how it would end. Drummond was overruled. He returned to the center of the platform and laid out the rules in a voice slightly less steady than it had been earlier that night. No eye strikes, no strikes to the throat, no weapons. Everything else permitted. Both men signaled they understood. Anatoly, with a low sound from somewhere deep in his chest. Bruce, with a single nod. Drummond looked at Bruce one final time, held it for 2 full seconds, then raised his hand. The building dropped into a hush, so complete the overhead ventilation system became audible for the first time all night. Drummond's hand came down. Anatoly moved immediately. Not charging, advancing, with the same unhurried inevitability as a tide coming in, both arms beginning to spread wide as he closed the gap. This was the approach that had worked 68 times across 9 countries, already in motion, already executing. Bruce moved backward, not retreating. The difference mattered enormously, and it was the difference that the more experienced fight people in the building recognized immediately, the distinction between a man running and a man working through the opening steps of a problem he has already solved in his head. Bruce's backward movement was precise, exact, maintaining the same distance from the advancing giant with every step. Anatoly pushed forward. Bruce slid back. The interval never changed. Anatoly's arms swept inward, trying to compress the space. trying to corner Bruce against the platform's edge. Bruce circled, tight, controlled adjustments rather than wide, sweeping arcs, staying just outside the radius of those enormous arms while staying close enough that Anatoly never stopped chasing. This wasn't avoidance. This was instruction. Every step Anatoly took was a step Bruce had already designed for him to take. Every reach was a response Bruce had already scripted in his head. The 700-pound man believed he was hunting. He was actually being taught a lesson he didn't know was starting yet. 2 seconds in, Anatoly's breathing had already changed. Not from exhaustion. 2 seconds can't exhaust a body of any size, but from the basic metabolic cost of what 700 pounds requires just to move. Every forward step was a transaction between his mass and gravity was already charging interest. His lungs worked against the compression of his own chest, which carried more total weight than most men's entire bodies combined. He had been built for contact, for the moment his hands closed around a body, and his weight became decisive. He had never been built for being chased in circles. Bruce had understood this from the 8th row. A structure carrying 700 pounds is permanently negotiating with its own weight. Force it to move sideways, force it to change direction repeatedly, force it to reach and miss, and the negotiation turns into an argument the structure cannot win. By 3 seconds, Anatoly's face had flushed visibly. His footing was marginally less precise, his breathing audible in the first several rows. At 4 seconds, Bruce stopped moving entirely. He planted himself, still and centered, positioned slightly to Anatoly's left. The giant saw the stillness and reacted the way 68 fights had trained him to react. His left arm swung outward in a wide, hooking grab, the same motion that had closed around dozens of opponents and ended every single confrontation it had ever entered. The arm moved fast, for something attached to 700 pounds. It still wasn't fast enough. Bruce dropped. Not dramatically. A compact lowering of maybe 8 inches that let Anatoly's forearm pass through the space where Bruce's head had been a fraction of a second earlier. The missed grab pulled Anatoly's whole torso into rotation, his weight following his arm, shifting left, and his right side opened up completely. His right knee, suddenly bearing the full asymmetric load of 700 pounds, committed to a lunge, became for one precise instant the only thing holding up most of his body weight. Bruce's right leg moved, not upward, not a spinning technique, nothing flashy, a low, direct, linear sidekick, the heel driving into the outside of Anatoly's right knee, at exactly the angle a human knee joint is least equipped to resist. Lateral force against a fully loaded hinge carrying 700 pounds. The sound it produced reached the first 6 rows clearly, and several people there described it later as the sound that permanently changed how they thought about what a trained human body was capable of producing. Anatoly's right leg buckled inward. Not a total collapse. The sheer mass of muscle around the joint prevented that, but enough. Enough that his balance, already compromised by the missed grab and the rotation that followed, became impossible to recover. 700 pounds began to fall. The falling was slow, the way the biggest things always seem to fall slowly, the way a demolished building takes longer to hit the ground than logic suggests it should. Anatoly's frame tilted right. His damaged knee couldn't provide the correction that much tilting mass required. His left foot slammed down hard, trying to anchor, trying to redistribute the weight, but the platform gave him nothing back, and the momentum was already committed in a direction his body couldn't reverse. His arms reached for air that couldn't hold him up. 18,000 people watched 700 pounds of undefeated dominance lose its argument with gravity in something that felt stretched out but lasted under 2 seconds. His right knee hit the platform first, then his right hand slammed down, the wooden surface producing a sound audible up in the mezzanine, a deep resonant impact that traveled through the platform's supports into the floor and up through the seats themselves. He was down on one knee, his face twisted with pain, and with something the people in the first few rows could identify clearly and would describe consistently for years afterward. Bewilderment. Complete and total bewilderment. He hadn't touched the ground in a fight in over a decade. His body simply had no framework for what it was currently experiencing. Bruce stepped back. He didn't press forward, didn't advance on the kneeling giant. He returned to a neutral stance, hands at his sides, weight even, breathing exactly the same as it had been a minute earlier. He watched Anatoly with the focused attention of someone who has just performed something precise and is now simply monitoring the result. There was nothing on his face that looked like triumph, no performance for the crowd, just the same complete, undivided attention Bruce brought to everything, aimed entirely at the information directly in front of him. The building was making a sound with no clean name. Not cheering, because cheering requires a certainty about what just happened that 18,000 people hadn't reached yet. It was the sound of a crowd trying to confirm what their eyes had just sent their brains. People were standing, leaning forward, grabbing the arm of whoever sat next to them. Anatoly pushed himself back up, the effort visible even from the upper sections. He straightened slowly, testing the damaged knee, redistributing his weight, with the careful caution of a man who has just discovered one of his own foundations is cracked. He turned to face Bruce, and his expression had completely changed. The theatrical confidence was gone. The amusement he'd worn watching Bruce climb the stairs was gone. What remained, according to his manager, who knew that face across 9 countries and never once had seen this particular version of it, was something more specific than fear. The recognition of a danger he didn't have a category for, the understanding that the small man across from him hadn't yet shown everything he was capable of and was making a calculated decision about how much more to reveal. Bruce moved forward, not circling anymore, not patient the way he'd been in the opening seconds. Direct. 3 quick steps that closed the distance before Anatoly's damaged structure could even process the change. His left fist shot out in a straight punch that found Anatoly's solar plexus, that dense cluster of nerve endings sitting behind the lower sternum. The punch traveled maybe 6 inches, point of extension to point of contact. But behind those 6 inches sat everything that 2 decades of careful refinement had built, force generated through the rear foot, carried up through hip rotation, focused through the core, delivered through the fist, at a speed that witnesses later described the same consistent way. They said they saw his arm extend. They did not see the punch itself happen. Anatoly's diaphragm seized completely. 700 pounds of mass folded around the point of impact, the way a controlled demolition folds a building inward around its foundation charges, collapsing toward the source of the disruption. The air left his body in a deep involuntary bark that carried across the platform into the first several rows. The sound a body makes when its breathing gets interrupted, without any warning or consent involved. His hands dropped away from anything resembling a defensive position and wrapped around his own midsection. His eyes went wide, his mouth opened. Nothing came out, because words require a functioning diaphragm, and at that exact moment, Anatoly's wasn't functioning at all. He staggered. His already damaged right knee absorbed the shifting weight and immediately objected. He took 1 step backward, then another, and then his legs delivered their final verdict on the entire situation, which was that they were finished, that the negotiation with gravity was over, and the outcome of that negotiation was going to be the floor. He went down to both knees. The platform didn't groan this time. It cracked. One sharp report from somewhere inside the support structure beneath the surface, the sound of wood making its own complaint about the load it had just been asked to handle. Anatoly knelt there, both hands pressed against his midsection, his head lowered, his breathing a series of short, desperate attempts to convince his diaphragm to start working again. 7 seconds had passed since Drummond's hand came down. Drummond reached him in 3 quick strides, kneeling beside the giant, running through the urgent shorthand of a referee who has seen a fighter hurt and is checking exactly how hurt. Anatoly's manager was already climbing onto the platform, moving fast enough that he might have been positioned to do exactly that the moment things went wrong. He was talking rapidly, his hands hovering near Anatoly's shoulders without quite landing on them. But before Drummond or the manager reached any conclusion, Anatoly raised one hand off his midsection. The hand was massive enough to cover most of a man's face. It moved in a slow lateral sweep, back and forth, the universal signal that needed no translation in any language being spoken in that building that night. "Stop. This is finished. I am done." He raised his eyes to find Drummond, and the look in them was described later by the 4 ringside reporters, close enough to see it clearly. All 4 of them, independently, in their own words, for their own papers, using the same word: pleading. The man who had walked into the building with 68 wins and the specific confidence of someone who had never once been asked to reconsider his own assumptions was on his knees, looking up at a referee, begging to be let out of a fight that had lasted 7 seconds. Drummond stood and crossed both arms above his head. It was over. The amphitheater produced a noise the building had heard plenty of times before, from championship fights and title bouts and the biggest sporting moments its history contained. But the people present that night, many of whom had also been present for those earlier moments, said afterward that this sound was different. Not necessarily louder, but different in what it actually contained. Those other great roars had been the sound of expected things happening with unexpected perfection. This was the sound of an entire category getting destroyed in front of them. This was 18,000 people discovering, all at the same moment, that something they had assumed was simply fixed and unchangeable about the world was not fixed at all. that everything they believed about size and power and physical danger had just been quietly renovated in 7 seconds by a man who weighed less than a fifth of what his opponent did. Bruce stood at the center of the platform. He hadn't been touched once. His jacket was undisturbed. His breathing was indistinguishable from how it had been an hour earlier. He didn't raise his arms. He didn't play to the crowd. He didn't perform anything at all for the 18,000 people now on their feet, producing a sound loud enough to rattle the light fixtures up in the mezzanine. He bowed, a single small bow, not toward the crowd, but directed at Anatoly, who was still on his knees, still being attended to by Drummond and his manager, still working through the difficult process of convincing his own body the emergency was over. The bow wasn't theatrical. It wasn't condescending. It was the specific bow of someone acknowledging that the person across from them had come into this honestly and deserved to be recognized for it, regardless of how it ended. Anatoly looked up from the platform floor and saw the bow. He watched Bruce for a long moment. Then, with help from his manager and one of the medical staff who had come up onto the platform, he was brought slowly to his feet. He stood unsteadily, his right knee still complaining, his midsection still tender, his breathing still not fully recovered. He looked across the platform at the small man in the dark jacket who had just methodically and completely dismantled everything Anatoly Volkov had built across more than a decade and 9 countries in 7 seconds without taking a single point of contact in return. Anatoly spoke. His translator relayed it for the crowd still close enough to hear. He said he had fought men of every description in every country he had visited. He said he had never once, in any of those fights, experienced anything close to genuine fear. Then he paused. The translator waited. Anatoly said that tonight had been the second time he had felt fear in his entire career, not during the fight itself, not when his knee buckled or when his diaphragm seized, but in the moment before any of that happened, when the small man in the 8th row had stood up. Anatoly said, "I looked at his eyes when he rose from his seat, and I knew right then, I did not know what he was going to do to me. I only knew that whatever it turned out to be, there was nothing I could do to stop it. That was the fear, not the pain afterward, the certainty before." Bruce crossed the platform and extended his hand. Anatoly looked at it for a moment, then took it in both of his own enormous hands, wrapping them entirely around Bruce's. He held on for a long time. The building was still loud around them, still trying to process what it had just watched, still trying to make it fit somewhere inside everything it had previously understood about the world. Anatoly and Bruce stood together at the center of the platform, one man's hands wrapped completely around the other's, and the building kept roaring, and the lights kept burning overhead, and somewhere in the physics of what had just happened, something had been settled that neither man needed to put into words, because 7 seconds had already said it more clearly and more permanently than any words could have managed. Backstage, nearly an hour later, after the crowd had mostly cleared out into the cold Chicago night, Bruce found Anatoly sitting on a wooden bench in the corridor outside the locker rooms, a bag of ice pressed against his knee, his manager standing nearby, looking considerably calmer than he had on the platform. "You should sit," Anatoly said, in slow, careful English, gesturing at the space beside him on the bench. Bruce sat. "I want to ask you something," Anatoly said. "The kick, to my knee. How did you know exactly where to put it?" Bruce thought about how to answer honestly. "When you grabbed with your left arm, your weight shifted onto your right leg completely," he said. "For one moment, that knee was holding almost all of your weight by itself. I'd been watching how you moved since you walked out. I knew that moment was coming before you did." Anatoly absorbed this, working his jaw slightly. 68 fights, he said. "Nobody ever found that moment before." "Most people are watching your hands," Bruce said. "Or your size, not your weight distribution. That's a different kind of watching. It takes a long time to learn how to do it properly." Anatoly was quiet for a while, staring at the wall across from him. "I said I would break every bone in your body," he said finally, "in front of all those people." "I heard you," Bruce said. "I meant it when I said it." "I believe that you did," Bruce said. Anatoly looked at him. "Why did you still come up?" Bruce considered the question seriously. "Because you'd already decided what was going to happen before anything actually happened," he said. "That kind of certainty usually means someone hasn't actually been tested in a long time. I thought it was worth finding out if that was true." Anatoly nodded slowly, accepting this without argument. "It was true," he said. 15 years, nobody tested me. They just believed what they saw when I walked into a room, the same as I did." "That's not really their fault," Bruce said. "Size is convincing. Most people never get the chance to learn. It isn't the whole story." Anatoly managed something close to a tired laugh. "Tonight, I learned it," he said. "In 7 seconds." They sat together for a while longer in the quiet corridor, the noise of the emptying building fading slowly around them, and when Bruce finally stood to leave, Anatoly extended his hand one more time, and they shook on it properly, the way two people shake hands when something real has actually passed between them. The newspapers the next morning ran with the spectacle, the impossible mismatch, the giant who begged to stop after 7 seconds against a man who weighed a fraction of his size. But the people who were actually in that building remembered something a little different and considerably more important than the numbers. They remembered watching a man who had built his entire identity around being unbeatable discover, in front of 18,000 witnesses, that unbeatable had never really been true. It had just never been tested properly. And they remembered the bow that came right after, the moment when the man who could have humiliated him completely chose instead to simply acknowledge him, giant to giant, in the only language that actually mattered, once the 7 seconds were over.